Librarian murdered in 1955. Books hide secrets. The rain had been falling steadily over Manchester since early evening on March 23, 1955, turning the cobblestone streets into mirrors that reflected the yellow glow of gas lamps. Inside the Manchester Central Library, Eleanor Hartley worked alone in the rare books collection on the third floor, her reading lamp casting a warm circle of light across the mahogany desk. At 42 years old, she had devoted nearly 2 decades to this institution, and the smell of old leather and aged paper had become as familiar to her as her own perfume. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and returned the copy of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to its designated place on the shelf. The library would close in 30 minutes, and she wanted to finish cataloging the recent acquisition before heading home to her daughter Margaret. But as she reached for the next volume, her fingers brushed against something unusual, a book that shouldn't have been there, wedged between 2 17th-century manuscripts. She pulled it out carefully, frowning at the unfamiliar binding. The cover was unmarked, the leather worn smooth by countless hands. Eleanor opened it, expecting perhaps a misfiled Victorian novel, but instead found pages of dense text in what appeared to be German. Her German was passable, learned during her university years before the war, but the content made little sense. References to paintings, sculptures, dates, and prices. She was about to set it aside when a small piece of paper slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Eleanor bent down to retrieve it. The paper contained a list of numbers and initials, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Her heart began to beat faster. She had read enough mystery novels to recognize that this looked like some kind of code or accounting record. She glanced around the empty reading room, suddenly aware of how isolated she was on this floor. The building's thick stone walls and heavy curtains muffled any sound from the streets below. She should have left then. She should have locked the book in her desk and gone home to Margaret, perhaps mentioned it casually to Detective Inspector Groves at church on Sunday. Arthur Groves had been a friend of her late husband, and she trusted him. But Eleanor Hartley had spent her entire career pursuing knowledge, following threads of information wherever they led. She couldn't simply walk away from a mystery that had literally fallen into her hands. Eleanor carried the book back to her desk and began examining it more carefully. The binding, while old, had been recently repaired. She could see the newer thread along the spine. Someone had taken care to restore this volume, which seemed odd for a book with no identifying marks on its cover. She ran her fingers along the inside of the front cover and felt a slight irregularity in the leather. Using a letter opener, she carefully worked at the edge until a small pocket revealed itself, skillfully concealed in the binding's construction. Inside the pocket were 3 more pieces of paper, folded tightly. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded them. The first was a list of names, some English, some continental European. The second appeared to be a schedule of some kind, with dates spanning the past 6 months and continuing into April. The third was a crude map showing what looked like various locations in Manchester, marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. She heard a sound then, the distant click of a door closing somewhere in the building. Eleanor froze, listening intently. James Thornton, the night watchman, usually made his rounds at 9 o'clock, but her small desk clock showed only 8:15. Perhaps Henry Ashford had returned? Her assistant had left an hour ago, claiming a headache, but he might have forgotten something. Eleanor quickly tucked the papers back into their hiding place and closed the book. She stood up, intending to call out, but something stopped her. An instinct, perhaps, or simply the cumulative effect of finding hidden documents and cryptic codes. She switched off her desk lamp and moved quietly toward the reading room's entrance, staying close to the bookshelves. The third floor of the Manchester Central Library was a labyrinth of stacks and alcoves, designed in the grand Victorian tradition with high ceilings and narrow aisles. Eleanor knew every inch of it, had walked these paths thousands of times in near darkness when the blackout curtains were still up during the war. She moved silently toward the main staircase. The mysterious book clutched against her chest. She almost made it. She was perhaps 20 feet from the stairwell when a figure stepped out from behind the classical literature section. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The man was tall, dressed in a dark overcoat and hat that cast his face in shadow. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Working late, Mrs. Hartley?" The voice was cultured, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. Not threatening on the surface, but something in the tone made her skin prickle. "The library is closed," Eleanor said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You shouldn't be here." The man took a step closer, and in the dim light filtering through the reading room windows, she caught a glimpse of his face, angular features, dark eyes, a thin mustache. She didn't recognize him. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he said. Eleanor's grip tightened on the book. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please leave, or I'll call the watchman." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Thornton is indisposed at the moment. We won't be disturbed." He held out his hand. "The book, please. There's no need for unpleasantness." Eleanor's mind raced. The stairwell was too far. She would never make it before he caught her. The windows were too high, and even if she screamed, would anyone hear her through the thick glass and stone? Her office had a telephone, but that was in the opposite direction, past where the stranger stood. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to buy time. "What's in this book that's worth breaking into a library?" The man's expression hardened. "That's not your concern. You've stumbled into something far beyond your understanding, Mrs. Hartley. Give me the book, and you can go home to your daughter. Margaret, isn't it? 19 years old, studying literature at university. Such a bright future ahead of her." The mention of Margaret sent ice through Eleanor's veins. This wasn't a random encounter. These people, whoever they were, knew about her, had perhaps been watching her. She thought of her daughter's face, the way Margaret had kissed her cheek that morning before leaving for her lectures. She thought of how her husband Thomas had died 7 years ago, leaving her alone to raise their child. She had been so careful, so protective. "Don't you dare threaten my daughter," Eleanor said, and something in her voice made the man pause. "No threats necessary if you cooperate," he replied. "However, I must insist." Eleanor didn't wait to hear more. She threw the book directly at his face and ran. Not toward the stairs, which he would expect, but deeper into the stacks, toward the back service entrance that staff used for deliveries. She heard him curse in what sounded like German as the book struck him, then the heavy thud of his footsteps pursuing her. The narrow aisles worked to her advantage initially. She was smaller, more familiar with the layout. She darted left at the poetry section, right past philosophy, her sensible shoes making barely a whisper on the wooden floors. Behind her, she could hear him knocking into shelves, the rustle of his coat. She reached the service door and grabbed the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. Standard procedure after 6 o'clock. The key was in her office, hanging on a small hook beside her desk calendar. Eleanor wanted to scream in frustration. "There's nowhere to go, Mrs. Hartley." His voice came from somewhere in the stacks, closer than she'd expected. "Be reasonable." Eleanor pressed herself against the door, trying to think. The fire escape. There was a fire escape on the east side, accessed through the archives room. She would have to cross the main reading room to reach it. But if she could get there before he cut her off, she moved again, this time toward the archives. Her breathing was too loud in her own ears, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. The archives room door was propped open. She'd left it that way earlier when moving some boxes. She slipped inside and eased the door closed behind her, engaging the old-fashioned lock as quietly as possible. The archives room was pitch black, no windows to let in even the faint streetlight. Eleanor stood perfectly still, trying to orient herself. The fire escape window was straight ahead, approximately 15 feet, past 2 rows of filing cabinets. She had to move blind, trusting her memory of the layout. She had taken perhaps 5 steps when the door handle rattled. Eleanor froze. Then came a tremendous crash as something heavy struck the door. The old wood splintered, and she heard the lock give way. Light from the reading room flooded in, and Eleanor ran. She crashed into the first filing cabinet, sending papers flying. Pain exploded in her hip, but she kept moving. Behind her, she heard him enter the room. Her outstretched hands found the second row of cabinets, and she used them to guide herself toward where she knew the window must be. Her fingers touched the wall, then found the window frame. She fumbled with the latch, years of paint and disuse making it stick. The footsteps were getting closer. She could hear his breathing now, could smell cigarette smoke, and something else. Cologne, expensive and foreign. The latch gave way suddenly, and Eleanor shoved the window open. Cold rain and wind rushed in. The fire escape was there, metal stairs descending into the darkness. She got one leg through the window when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Eleanor screamed. Finally, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night. She twisted, trying to pull free, but his grip was iron strong. He yanked her backward, and she fell hard onto the floor of the archives room. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. "Foolish woman," he said, standing over her. In his right hand, he now held something that glinted in the dim light. A knife, small, but wickedly sharp. You could have simply cooperated. Eleanor scrambled backward until her shoulders hit a filing cabinet. Whatever you're doing, whatever that book contains, killing me won't help you. People will ask questions. The police will find a tragic accident, he interrupted. An overworked librarian, staying late, who fell from the fire escape in the rain. These old buildings, so poorly maintained. Such a shame. He crouched down to her level, the knife held loosely in his hand. But first, you're going to tell me if you read those documents, and if you told anyone about them. Eleanor's mind was working frantically, even through the fear. If she said yes, he would kill her as a liability. If she said no, he might not believe her. Her only chance was to give him an answer that bought time, that made her valuable alive. I couldn't read most of it, she said, which was true. The German was too technical, but I photographed the pages. The lie came smoothly. I have a camera in my office. I developed the film earlier and mailed the photographs to a colleague at Oxford for translation. He should receive them tomorrow. The man's face went very still. You're lying. Check my office, Eleanor said. There's a camera in the bottom drawer. The film is gone. He studied her for a long moment, then slowly stood up. Show me. Eleanor got to her feet, her hip throbbing where she'd struck the cabinet. He gestured with the knife toward the door, and she walked ahead of him back into the reading room. Her mind raced. There was indeed a camera in her office. She'd used it occasionally to document damaged books for insurance purposes. But there was no film, no photographs sent to Oxford. She just needed him to look, needed a moment when his attention was divided. They reached her office, and he motioned her inside. The drawer. Open it slowly. Eleanor knelt beside her desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. The camera was there, along with some notebooks and files. She reached for it with shaking hands. Stop. His voice cracked like a whip. Move away from the desk. She obeyed, and he moved forward to examine the drawer himself, the knife still in one hand. This was her moment. On the desk, beside her lamp, was a heavy brass bookend in the shape of an owl. A gift from Margaret last Christmas. Eleanor grabbed it and swung with all her strength. She aimed for his head, but he turned at the last second, and the bookend caught him on the shoulder instead. He grunted in pain and stumbled backward, but he didn't fall. His face contorted with rage, and he lunged at her with the knife. Eleanor threw herself to the side, and the blade missed her throat by inches. She felt it slice through the fabric of her cardigan and bite into her upper arm. Hot pain bloomed, and warm blood began to soak through her sleeve. She grabbed for the lamp, yanking it toward him, but the cord pulled taut and it fell short. He was on her then, one hand grabbing her throat, the other raising the knife. Eleanor clawed at his face, her fingernails leaving bloody furrows down his cheek. He swore viciously and slammed her head against the desk. Stars exploded across her vision. Should have taken the easy way, he hissed, and plunged the knife down. Eleanor felt the impact, the terrible cold-hot sensation of the blade entering just below her ribs. She gasped, more in shock than pain initially. He pulled the knife free and stabbed again and again. The pain came then, overwhelming, obliterating thought. She was dimly aware of falling, of the hard floor against her cheek. Warm liquid was spreading beneath her, soaking into her blouse and skirt. Her glasses had fallen off somewhere. The world had become a blur of shadow and dim light. The man was moving around her office now, searching. She heard drawers opening, papers rustling. He was looking for the non-existent photographs, the film that didn't exist. Eleanor wanted to laugh at the irony, but she couldn't seem to make her body work properly. Her breaths came in wet, rattling gasps. She thought of Margaret, her beautiful, brilliant daughter who had inherited Thomas's dark hair and Eleanor's love of books. Who would tell her? Who would hold her while she cried? Would Arthur Groves handle the investigation personally? She hoped so. Arthur was thorough. Arthur would find the truth. The mysterious book was still out there somewhere, in the reading room where she'd thrown it. The papers were still hidden in its binding. If she died, and Eleanor knew with terrible certainty that she was dying, would anyone else discover what she'd found? Would her death mean anything? Or would these people simply continue their illegal operations? Whatever they were, her vision was darkening at the edges. The man had stopped searching and now stood over her again. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she heard his breathing, ragged from exertion and anger. "Damn you," he said quietly. There were no photographs, were there? Eleanor couldn't answer, couldn't move. The floor beneath her was so cold, and she was so tired. She heard his footsteps move away, heard him speaking in rapid German to someone else. When had a second person arrived? The words were meaningless sounds now. Then footsteps receding, a door closing, and finally, silence. Eleanor Hartley died at approximately 8:47 on the evening of March 23, 1955, alone on the floor of her office in the Manchester Central Library. Her eyes remained open. Staring sightlessly at the ceiling, she had looked up at countless times over 2 decades of service. Blood pooled around her body, seeping between the floorboards, dripping down to the reference section on the floor below. James Thornton, the night watchman, would find her at 9:23, when he finally recovered consciousness from the blow that had been dealt to the back of his head in the basement. His anguished shout would wake the homeless man sleeping in the library's side alley, who would alert a passing constable. Within an hour, the building would be swarming with police officers, photographers, and forensics specialists. But Eleanor Hartley wouldn't know any of this. She was already gone, taking with her the truth of what she'd discovered in those final fatal hours. Detective Inspector Arthur Groves stood in the doorway of Eleanor Hartley's office and felt something. Inside him, crack. He had known Eleanor for 15 years, since he'd worked alongside her husband Thomas in the Home Guard during the war. He'd watched Margaret grow from a gap-toothed child to a poised young woman. He'd had dinner at their house just last month, listening to Eleanor talk enthusiastically about a new acquisition of medieval manuscripts. Now she was a crime scene. "Sir?" Detective Sergeant Robert Mills stood beside him, notebook already in hand. Mills was young, barely 25, eager and competent, but lacking the years of experience that taught you how to compartmentalize. His face had gone pale when they'd first entered the office. Groves took a deep breath and forced himself into professional detachment. He could grieve later. Right now, Eleanor deserved his best work. "What do we know?" Mills consulted his notes. "Victim is Eleanor Hartley, age 42, head librarian here, night watchman. James Thornton found her at 9:23 p.m. He'd been knocked unconscious around 8 o'clock. Says he was checking the basement furnace when someone struck him from behind. Woke up with a nasty bump on his skull, but otherwise unharmed." Groves stepped carefully into the office, avoiding the blood. The police photographer had already done his work, the flashbulbs leaving ghostly after images. Eleanor lay on her left side, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something, multiple stab wounds visible on her torso. A brass bookend lay near the desk, and a lamp had been pulled off the desktop, its cord stretched taut. "She fought," Groves said quietly. "Yes, sir. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Something under her fingernails. Forensics will check, but likely skin or blood from the assailant." Mills swallowed hard. "The medical examiner estimates death occurred between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Multiple stab wounds, at least 5. The killer used a thin blade, approximately 4 inches long." Groves studied the office. Drawers had been pulled open, their contents disturbed. Papers were scattered across the desk. "Robbery? Her handbag is still here. Purse intact with 3 pounds and 7 shillings inside. She's still wearing her wedding ring and a watch. So not robbery." Groves moved to the desk, examining the papers without touching them. Catalog entries, acquisition forms, correspondence with book dealers. Nothing obvious. What was she working on? According to Mr. Ashford, Henry Ashford, the assistant librarian, Mrs. Hartley was cataloging recent additions to the rare books collection. He left at 7:15, said she seemed normal, planned to finish up and leave by 8:30. Groves looked at the empty shelves in the reading room beyond. "Where are these rare books?" "That's the peculiar thing, sir. Mr. Ashford says nothing appears to be missing from the collection. He's done a preliminary inventory. Every logged book is accounted for. Then what was the killer searching for?" Groves gestured at the disturbed desk. This wasn't random violence. Someone was looking for something specific. A uniformed constable appeared in the doorway. "Sir, there's a young woman downstairs. Says she's the victim's daughter. We've been keeping her in the lobby. But, Margaret," Groves felt his chest tighten. "I'll speak with her. Mills, I want every inch of this office processed. Fingerprints on everything. And get me a complete list of everyone who entered this building today. Staff, patrons, delivery men, everyone." "Yes, sir." Groves made his way down to the main lobby, steeling himself. Margaret Hartley sat in one of the reading chairs, wrapped in an oversized coat that probably belonged to one of the constables. Her face was colorless, eyes red-rimmed but dry. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression shattered. "Uncle Arthur," she whispered, using the honorary title she'd called him since childhood. "They won't tell me. Is it true? Is Mum really? He sat down beside her and took her cold hands in his. I'm so sorry, Margaret. Yes, it's true. She made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, doubling over as if someone had struck her. Groves put an arm around her shoulders and let her cry. This girl who had lost her father at 12, and now her mother at 19. When the first storm of grief had passed, he spoke gently. I need to ask you some questions. I know the timing is terrible, but anything you can tell me might help us find who did this. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded. Anything. Ask me anything. When did you last see your mother? This morning, around 7:30. I was leaving for my lectures and she was having breakfast. She seemed fine. Normal. She said she might work late tonight because there was a backlog of cataloging work. Did she mention being worried about anything? Anyone bothering her? Anything unusual happening at the library? Margaret frowned, thinking, no, nothing like that. Although, she paused. Last week, maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, she came home and seemed distracted. I asked if something was wrong, and she said she'd found some inconsistencies in the records. Books that had been checked out but weren't logged properly, or something like that. She was planning to investigate it further. Groves felt a prickle of interest. Did she say anything else about these inconsistencies? No, I didn't think much of it at the time. She was always finding little errors in the library's systems. Margaret's voice broke. Do you think that's why? That someone killed her over library records? I don't know yet, but I promise you, Margaret, I will find out. Your mother was one of the finest people I've ever known. She deserves justice, and you deserve answers. Margaret looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. She would have fought, wouldn't she? Mum was always so proper, so careful, but she was fierce when it mattered. During the war, when the bombs were falling, she refused to stop working at the library, said the Nazis could destroy the buildings, but they couldn't destroy knowledge. She would have fought whoever did this. She did fight, Groves said gently. She fought hard. He arranged for a constable to take Margaret home, with a WPC to stay with her through the night. Then he returned to the 3rd floor, where Mills was supervising the forensics team's work. Found something interesting, sir, Mills said, leading him to the reading room. This book was on the floor near the classical literature section. No catalog number, no library markings. Mr. Ashford says he's never seen it before. Groves looked at the volume Mills indicated. Unmarked leather binding, worn but well-maintained. He pulled on gloves before picking it up. What's inside? Appears to be German text. Technical descriptions of artwork and antiques, I think. There are also some loose papers tucked in the binding, lists of names and numbers. Groves opened the book carefully. The German was beyond his linguistic skills, but he recognized enough to see that Mills was right about the subject matter. Paintings, sculptures, dates, prices. The lists were more cryptic. Initials followed by amounts. KM, 450, TW, 720, PB, 325. Initials and prices, he murmured. Payment records? He looked at Mills. Get this to someone who reads German fluently. I want a complete translation by morning, and I want these initials cross-referenced with anyone who's had dealings with this library in the past. Year. Right away, sir. Groves continued examining the office, noting every detail. A camera in the bottom drawer, no film. A calendar on the wall with Eleanor's neat handwriting marking various appointments and deadlines. A photograph on the desk showing Eleanor and Margaret at the seaside, both smiling. At 11:30 p.m., Groves finally left the library, his mind churning. Eleanor had found something, those inconsistencies she'd mentioned to Margaret. This mysterious German book with its hidden records, and someone had killed her to keep it quiet. But keep what quiet? What secret was worth a librarian's life? As he drove through the rain-slicked streets of Manchester, passing the bomb-damaged building still being rebuilt 10 years after the war's end, Arthur Groves made a silent promise to his dead friend's widow. He would find the truth, no matter where it led, no matter who was involved. He would bring Eleanor's killer to justice. He just didn't realize yet how deep the corruption ran, or how many lies he would have to uncover before the truth finally emerged. The morning papers screamed the headlines: Librarian murdered in Manchester Library, and Brutal killing shock city. By 8 a.m., Detective Inspector Groves was back at the Central Library, having had perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep. The building was closed to the public. Yellow police tape cordoning off the 3rd floor. Henry Ashford sat in the library's staff room, looking haggard. He was 35, but seemed older this morning, his thin face drawn with exhaustion and shock. Groves sat down across from him with 2 cups of tea from the canteen. "Thank you for coming in early, Mr. Ashford," Groves said, pushing 1 cup toward him. "I know this is difficult." Ashford wrapped his hands around the cup but didn't drink. "I can't believe she's gone. Eleanor was the heart of this place. Everyone loved her. Tell me about yesterday. Everything you remember." Ashford took a shaky breath. "I arrived at 8:30, as usual. Eleanor was already here. She always came in early. We had a normal morning, working in separate areas. Around noon, we had lunch together in the staff room. Sandwiches and tea. She seemed fine. We discussed the new acquisitions that had arrived last week. Planned out the cataloging schedule. Did anyone unusual come into the library? Anyone who paid particular attention to the rare books collection? We get researchers up there regularly. Professors, graduate students, serious collectors. Everyone has to sign the register." Ashford set down his tea and produced a leather-bound logbook. "These are all the people who accessed the 3rd floor yesterday." Groves scanned the names. Professor Martin Wells from the university. 2 graduate students. A man named David Pearson who listed himself as an independent researcher. "Tell me about Pearson." "Never seen him before yesterday. He arrived around 2 in the afternoon, said he was researching 17th century English poetry. Spent about 90 minutes in the reading room, left around 3:30. Description? Tall, maybe 6 feet. Dark hair, dark coat, mustache. Spoke well, educated accent. He showed identification, said he was from London." Groves felt something click in his mind. Did Eleanor interact with him? Briefly. She helped him locate some volumes. Nothing seemed amiss. "I'll need everything you can remember about him. And I want to speak with everyone on this list." Groves closed the logbook. "Mr. Ashford, Eleanor's daughter mentioned that her mother had found some inconsistencies in the library records. Do you know anything about that?" Ashford's expression changed, became guarded. She mentioned it to me, last week." "What exactly did she find?" Ashford was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words. Finally, he said, "There were books being borrowed from the rare collection that weren't being properly logged. Or rather, they were logged, but the records didn't match. Someone had been altering the entries. Altering them how? Making it appear that books had been checked out by legitimate researchers, when in fact they'd been removed for different purposes. Eleanor started noticing it about 3 weeks ago. She was meticulous about our records, and something didn't add up." Groves leaned forward. "Did she tell you who she suspected?" "No, but she was investigating. She'd been cross-referencing the checkout records with the actual researcher visits, looking for discrepancies." Ashford met Groves's eyes. "I think that's what got her killed. Inspector, I think she found out who was behind it." "Behind what exactly?" "I don't know. Theft, maybe? Some of these rare books are worth hundreds, even thousands of pounds. Collectors will pay extraordinary prices for the right pieces." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. About 3 months ago, Eleanor came to me concerned about one of our patrons, Thomas Whitmore. He's a wealthy collector, been using our library for years. She said he'd been asking very specific questions about books we'd acquired during and right after the war." Groves wrote down the name. "Why did that concern her?" "Because some of those books came from questionable sources. During the war, many libraries and private collections across Europe were looted. Art, books, manuscripts, all stolen by the Nazis. After the war, the black market was flooded with these items. Manchester acquired some pieces from dealers who claimed everything was legitimate, but Eleanor always wondered, You think Whitmore was looking for stolen books? I think he might have been looking for something specific, and I think someone in this library might have been helping him get access to items that weren't available to the general public." Groves felt the case taking shape in his mind. A smuggling operation, using the library as cover. Eleanor had discovered it, and been killed to silence her. The mysterious German book with its lists of prices and initials, that had to be connected. "Do you have an address for Whitmore?" "He lives in Altrincham. Very grand house, from what I understand. His family made their fortune in textiles. I'll pay him a visit." Groves stood. "In the meantime, I need you to go through those records again. I want a complete list of every book that was improperly logged in the past year, and I want to know who had access to alter those records." Ashford nodded. "There's only 3 of us with keys to the rare books collection and access to the master catalog. Eleanor, myself, and James Thornton, though James rarely goes up there unless there's a maintenance issue." "What about the library director?" "Mr. Patterson has a master key to every room, of course, but he's barely here. Spends most of his time at the central office dealing with administration." Groves made, notes. One more question. The book we found. Unmarked leather binding. German text about artwork. Have you ever seen it before? Ashford frowned. No. We don't have any uncatalogued books in Rare Collection. Every volume is registered and tracked, so it shouldn't have been there at all. No. Someone must have brought it in. Groves left the library with more questions than answers, but at least now he had a direction. Thomas Whitmore would be his first stop, but first, he needed to check in with forensics and see if the German book had been translated. At the police station, Detective Sergeant Mills met him with news. We've got preliminary forensics, sir. The blood and skin under Mrs. Hartley's fingernails is being typed now. We lifted several sets of prints from the office. Hers, Ashford's, a few others still being identified, and we found something interesting on that brass bookend. Blood? Yes, sir. Not Mrs. Hartley's. Whoever killed her, she got in at least one good hit. There's also hair, dark, probably male. Excellent. And the book? Professor Dietrich from the university translated it. You're going to want to read this, sir. Mills handed him a typed report. Groves read quickly, his expression darkening. The German text was indeed about artwork, specifically, art and antiquities looted by the Nazis during the war. The book was a dealer's catalog, listing pieces available for sale on the black market. The prices were astronomical, the items clearly stolen. Paintings by old masters, illuminated manuscripts, rare books, religious artifacts, all described in detail with pre-war provenance information that would allow buyers to claim the pieces had legitimate origins. The hidden lists were even more damning. They showed sales made over the past 2 years, with the initials of buyers and amounts paid. Groves recognized some of the initials from the library's patron records. T.W. appeared multiple times. Thomas Whitmore. This is evidence of a major smuggling operation, Groves said grimly. Stolen Nazi loot being sold in Britain to collectors too greedy or foolish to ask questions. He looked at Mills. Eleanor Hartley didn't just discover irregularities in library records. She discovered that her library was being used as a front for black market dealers, probably letting buyers examine the goods under the guise of legitimate research. Who's running it? That's what we need to find out. But Whitmore is clearly involved as a buyer. Let's go have a chat with him. Thomas Whitmore's house in Altrincham was everything Ashford had suggested. A sprawling Victorian mansion set back from the road behind iron gates and manicured gardens. A maid answered the door and led them to a study lined with mahogany shelves. Every surface held books, sculptures, small paintings, a collector's paradise. Whitmore himself was 58, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. He greeted them with polite confusion. Gentlemen, I heard about poor Mrs. Hartley on the wireless this morning. Dreadful business. How can I help? Groves decided on a direct approach. I understand you're a frequent patron of the Manchester Central Library, particularly the rare books collection. Yes, for many years. I'm a collector, as you can see. Elizabethan and Jacobean literature is my particular passion. And you've made purchases through dealers who operate internationally? Whitmore's eyes sharpened. I buy from reputable auction houses and established dealers. All of my acquisitions are properly documented. Including the items you purchased through this catalog? Groves produced the German book, watching Whitmore's reaction carefully. For just a moment, the collector's composure cracked. His face went pale, then flushed red. I don't know what that is. It's a catalog of stolen artwork and antiquities. Nazi loot being sold on the black market. Your initials appear multiple times in the transaction records. That's absurd. I've never... Whitmore stopped, seeming to realize he was about to commit himself to a lie. He sat down heavily in one of his leather chairs. I want my solicitor present before I answer any more questions. You're not under arrest, Mr. Whitmore. Yet. But a woman has been murdered, and you're connected to evidence found at the scene. You can cooperate now, or I can drag you down to the station, and we can do this formally. Whitmore was silent for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. Finally he spoke. I bought some items, yes, but I didn't know they were stolen. The dealer assured me everything was legitimate, with proper documentation. What dealer? Victor Brennan. He owns an antiquarian bookshop in the northern quarter. I've purchased from him for years, long before the war. He approached me about 2 years ago with opportunities to acquire exceptional pieces at reasonable prices. Reasonable prices because they were stolen, Mills interjected. Whitmore looked miserable. I suspected eventually, but by then I'd already made several purchases. Brennan implied that if I stopped buying, or if I went to the authorities, Certain information about my existing acquisitions might become public. I would have been ruined, socially, financially. So I continued. And the library? How does that fit in? Brennan used the rare books collection as a viewing room. He would arrange for items to be brought to the library, disguised as legitimate research materials. Buyers like myself would view them there under the pretense of academic study, then complete transactions elsewhere. It was quite clever, really. Who would suspect illegal activity in a public library? Groves felt cold fury building. Who else was involved? Who at the library was helping Brennan? I don't know. I only ever dealt with Brennan directly. He would tell me when to visit the library and what to ask for. The books would be there, waiting. I assumed he'd bribed someone on staff, but I never knew who. Did Eleanor Hartley know what you were doing? No, or at least I don't think so. She was always very professional, very helpful, but a few weeks ago she started asking me questions, where I'd purchased certain items, whether I'd kept documentation. I had the sense she was becoming suspicious. Whitmore's voice shook. But I didn't kill her, Inspector. Yes, I'm guilty of purchasing stolen property, of being part of this awful scheme. But murder? Never. I haven't even been to the library in over a week. Groves studied him. The man seemed genuinely frightened and ashamed. He also seemed to be telling the truth, at least about the murder. You said you last dealt with Brennan when? He telephoned me 2 days ago, Tuesday afternoon. Said there were some complications and advised me to stay away from the library for a while. I didn't ask questions. I've learned not to. Complications, Groves repeated, meaning Eleanor was getting too close to the truth. Whitmore didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Groves stood. You're coming with us to the station, Mr. Whitmore. You're going to give a complete statement about every illegal transaction, every person you've had contact with, and everything you know about Brennan's operation. And then you're going to pray that your cooperation is enough to keep you out of prison. As they led Whitmore to the car, Mills asked quietly, Do you think he's our killer, sir? No. He's a greedy fool who enabled a criminal enterprise, but I don't see him as a murderer. Brennan, though, he's a different story. If Eleanor threatened his operation, he would have had motive and opportunity. Let's pay him a visit. The afternoon was drawing in as they drove back to Manchester, the sky heavy with rain. Groves felt they were finally making progress, but he also felt uneasy. Eleanor had been killed over 24 hours ago. Brennan would know by now that the police were investigating. If he had any sense, he'd already be gone. The bookshop in the northern quarter was closed. A sign in the window reading, Family Emergency, closed until further notice. Groves wasn't surprised. They broke in through the back entrance, finding a space that was part legitimate bookshop, part smuggler's den. The main room held ordinary second-hand books, the kind any casual browser might purchase. But the back room was different. Locked steel cabinets, cataloging systems, correspondence with continental dealers. Mills whistled low. He was running a significant operation here. Groves examined the paperwork, finding shipping manifests, false customs declarations, financial records. Brennan had been moving stolen goods through Britain for at least 3 years, using multiple fronts including the library. The amounts involved were staggering. Find anything with recent dates, Groves ordered. Letters, appointments, anything that might tell us where he's gone. They searched for an hour before Mills found it. A telegram sent on Tuesday morning to an address in Antwerp, Belgium. Transaction compromised. Closing operations. Will contact when secure. He's fled the country, Mills said. Possibly. But he needed to deal with Eleanor first. The question is, did he do it himself? Or did he send someone? Groves thought about the description Ashford had given of the mysterious researcher, David Pearson. Dark hair, mustache, tall, educated accent. Get me everything we have on Brennan's known associates, and check passenger lists for anyone leaving the country in the past 24 hours, matching Pearson's description. As they worked into the evening, the pieces of the puzzle gradually assembled. Brennan had been running a sophisticated operation, importing stolen Nazi loot through Belgium and the Netherlands, using his legitimate bookshop as cover. He'd cultivated relationships with wealthy collectors like Whitmore, who were willing to overlook provenance issues, and he'd bribed or coerced someone at the library to provide access to the rare books collection for his covert viewings. But who at the library was the inside man, and who had actually wielded the knife that killed Eleanor? It was approaching midnight when they got the breakthrough. A constable had been going through the library's employment records and found something odd. Henry Ashford, the assistant librarian, had taken an extended leave of absence 3 years ago. 6 months to visit family in South Africa, according to his records. But there was no evidence he'd ever left the country. No passport application. No ship manifest listing his name. Why lie about going away? Mills wondered. Groves felt ice in his stomach. Check his finances. Bank records, spending patterns, anything you can find. It took 3 hours and several calls to bank managers' homes, but the picture that emerged was damning. 3 years ago, Ashford had been drowning in gambling debts, nearly £2,000 owed to various bookmakers and loan sharks. Then suddenly, the debts were paid off. The supposed 6-month absence coincided exactly with when the payments were made. Brennan bought him, Groves said, paid off his debts in exchange for access to the library. But Ashford was here last night, Mills pointed out. He left at 7:15, said he had a headache, and he reported finding the body this morning. Seemed genuinely shocked. He was shocked because he didn't expect Eleanor to be killed. Maybe he thought Brennan would just steal the catalog back, or threaten Eleanor into silence. Groves grabbed his coat. Come on, we're bringing him in. They arrived at Ashford's flat in Fallowfield at 1 a.m, pounding on the door until a bleary-eyed neighbor informed them that Mr. Ashford had left hours ago, carrying a suitcase. He'd told her he was going to visit his sick mother in Brighton. He's running, Mills said. Not yet. Check the train stations, the coach terminals. He's only got a few hours head start, and it's the middle of the night. Limited options. They found him at Manchester Victoria Station, sitting on a bench in the deserted waiting room, his suitcase beside him. He didn't run when they approached. He just looked up at them with tired, defeated eyes. I knew you'd figure it out, Ashford said quietly. I'm not a clever man, Inspector. Not clever like Brennan. They took him back to the station and charged him. Then, in a drab interview room with pale fluorescent lights humming overhead, Henry Ashford told his story. It started 3 years ago. I had gambling problems. Horses, mostly. Got in deep with the wrong people. Brennan found out somehow. He had connections everywhere. He offered me a deal. Let him use the library for his business, and he'd pay off my debts. What did that entail? Groves asked. Just providing access, initially. He'd bring buyers to the rare books collection after hours, or during quiet periods. Let them examine the merchandise. I would make sure the 3rd floor was empty, turn a blind eye. Sometimes I'd alter the checkout records to cover his tracks. And Eleanor never noticed? Ashford's face crumpled. She was too trusting, too honest. She believed in the integrity of our systems. Never thought one of her own staff would betray her. He wiped his eyes. About 3 weeks ago, she started noticing the discrepancies. I tried to fix the records, but I'd made mistakes. She began investigating. I warned Brennan, told him we needed to shut down the operation for a while. What did he say? He said he'd handle it. I thought he meant he'd lay low, wait for things to blow over. But then on Tuesday, he told me that Eleanor had found his catalog. She'd discovered it hidden in the reading room. He'd left it there by accident after a viewing the previous week. He said she'd examined it, found the hidden records. She knew everything. And he decided to kill her. No. Yes. But I didn't know that's what he was planning. He just said he needed to retrieve the catalog, that he'd take care of it. I thought he meant he'd steal it back or something. Ashford's voice rose desperately. I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't know he was going to hurt her. Eleanor was my friend, my mentor. I never would have, but you did, Groves said coldly. You let a killer into that library. You gave him access, opportunity. You're as guilty of her murder as if you'd held the knife yourself. I left early because Brennan told me to. Said I shouldn't be there that evening, that it was better I didn't know details. I thought, God help me, I thought he was just going to burgle the place, search her office, take the book, leave. But when I heard on the wireless this morning that she was dead, Ashford buried his face in his hands. I didn't sleep all night, kept thinking I should come forward. But I was terrified. Brennan had made it clear what would happen if I talked. Where is Brennan now? I don't know. He contacted me Wednesday morning, told me everything had gone wrong, that Eleanor had fought and been killed. He said he was leaving the country, that I should keep my mouth shut and act normal. Said if I implicated him, his associates would make sure I didn't live to testify. Mills spoke up. Who actually killed Mrs. Hartley? Was it Brennan himself? I think so. He called himself David Pearson when he visited the library Tuesday afternoon. Wore a false mustache. I didn't interact with him. Stayed out of the way like he'd told me to. But the description matches. Groves felt a grim satisfaction. They had the full picture now, at least of how it had happened. Brennan, using the alias David Pearson, had visited the library during the day to scout it out, confirm Eleanor was working late. He'd returned after hours, used his access through Ashford to get in, attacked the night watchman, then confronted Eleanor when she discovered what he was looking for. She'd fought, wounded him with the bookend, but he'd overpowered her and stabbed her to death. Then he'd searched for evidence, taken his catalog, and fled. "I want a complete description of Brennan," Groves said. "Everything you know about him. Appearance, associates, contacts abroad. You're going to help us find him, Mr. Ashford. It won't save you from prison, but it might make your sentence more bearable." Over the next hour, Ashford provided everything he knew. Victor Brennan was 45, 5'11", dark hair going gray, brown eyes, clean-shaven normally, but he owned several false beards and mustaches for his dealings, had connections in Belgium, Netherlands, and France, maintained accounts in multiple countries, spoke fluent French and German, had a brother in Antwerp who dealt in art. "He'll go to Belgium," Ashford said. "He has safe houses there, people who owe him favors." Groves immediately contacted Interpol and Scotland Yard's International Division, providing Brennan's description and known aliases. Ports were alerted, but he knew it was likely too late. Brennan had had nearly 30 hours head start. By now, he could be anywhere in Europe, probably already hidden in the smuggling network he'd built over years. As dawn broke over Manchester on Friday morning, Detective Inspector Arthur Groves sat at his desk, exhausted but determined. They had solved the how and why of Eleanor Hartley's murder. They had caught the inside man, but the actual killer remained free, somewhere across the channel. He picked up the telephone and called Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and grief. "Margaret, it's Arthur. I wanted you to hear this from me before you see it in the papers. We've made arrests in your mother's case." He explained what they'd discovered: the smuggling ring, Ashford's betrayal, Brennan's flight. Margaret listened in silence, then said, "Will they catch him? This Brennan? I'll do everything in my power to make sure they do. The Continental Police are looking for him now. And if they don't?" Groves had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them until Margaret spoke again. "Mum died trying to do the right thing, to stop something criminal. That's how I want to remember her. Not as a victim, but as someone who stood up against corruption, even when it cost her everything. That's exactly who she was," Groves said gently. "One of the bravest people I've ever known." After he hung up, Groves went to the evidence room and looked at the items recovered from Eleanor's office. Her glasses, found beneath the desk. The brass owl bookend, now smeared with fingerprint powder and tagged as evidence. The photograph of Eleanor and Margaret at the seaside, the glass cracked but their smiling faces still visible. He made another silent promise. Brennan might have escaped for now, but Groves would never stop looking, never stop pushing the international investigation. Eleanor deserved justice, and Margaret deserved closure. The case would haunt the Manchester police for years. Despite extensive manhunts, Victor Brennan was never apprehended. There were occasional sightings, in Brussels in 1957, in Marseille in 1961, but he always vanished before authorities could act. It was suspected he had undergone plastic surgery and assumed a new identity, continuing his black market dealings under a different name. Henry Ashford was tried and convicted of conspiracy to murder and trafficking in stolen goods. He received a sentence of 20 years in prison, serving 16 before being released in 1971. He spent his remaining years working in a Manchester warehouse, living alone, never marrying. He died of a heart attack in 1984, having never spoken publicly about the case beyond his courtroom testimony. Thomas Whitmore cooperated fully with investigators, providing detailed records of his illegal purchases. He was fined heavily and forced to return all stolen items to their countries of origin. His reputation in Manchester society never recovered. He sold his collection and his house, moving to a small cottage in Wales where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1968. The smuggling ring was largely dismantled. Police across Europe arrested more than 30 people connected to the operation, recovering artwork and antiquities worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. But the main architect of the scheme, Victor Brennan, remained at large, a ghost haunting the edges of the black market art world. Margaret Hartley finished her university degree, graduating with honors in 1957. She became a teacher, spending 30 years educating children in Manchester. She never married, dedicating herself instead to preserving her mother's memory. In 1972, she established the Eleanor Hartley Memorial Scholarship at the Manchester Central Library, providing funding for young people pursuing careers in library sciences and archival work. Detective Inspector Arthur Groves continued pursuing leads on Brennan until his retirement in 1965. Even afterward, he maintained contact with Interpol, hoping for news of an arrest that never came. He attended every anniversary memorial held for Eleanor, standing beside Margaret as they honored a woman who had died for the sake of truth and justice. The Manchester Central Library still stands, its third-floor rare books collection meticulously maintained. A small plaque was installed in Eleanor's office in 1956, reading, "In memory of Eleanor Hartley, 1913-1955, librarian, scholar, guardian of knowledge. She gave her life in service to truth, but the full story of what happened that rainy March evening remained largely unknown to the public. The details were too complex, too dark, involving too many prominent citizens. The official narrative became simpler. A brave librarian had discovered a theft ring and been killed by criminals who then escaped justice. It was true enough, if incomplete. 20 years later, in March of 1975, on the 20th anniversary of Eleanor's death, Margaret Hartley stood in the third-floor reading room of the Manchester Central Library. She was 39 now, a respected teacher with silver beginning to show in her dark hair. She'd come alone this year. Arthur Groves had died the previous autumn, finally reunited with the friend he'd tried so hard to avenge. Margaret walked slowly through the stacks, trailing her fingers along the spines of books. This place had taken her mother from her, but it had also been Eleanor's great love. These books, this knowledge, this service to the community. That was what her mother had lived for. She reached the section where Eleanor had died, where the brass bookend had struck Victor Brennan, where her mother had fought for her life. The blood was long since scrubbed away, the floor refinished, all physical traces of violence erased, but Margaret could still see it in her mind, could imagine those final moments when Eleanor had realized she was going to die but fought anyway. "I hope you hurt him." "Mum," Margaret whispered to the empty air, "I hope you gave him scars he carried the rest of his life." Unknown to Margaret, her wish had been granted. Victor Brennan, living under the name Philippe Mercier in a small town outside Lyon, France, bore a distinctive scar on his left cheek, where Eleanor's fingernails had torn through skin. He told people it was from the war, a story that gained him sympathy rather than questions. The scar on his shoulder from the bookend was hidden beneath clothing, but it ached in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the librarian who had refused to be a victim. Brennan had survived, had even prospered in a way, continuing his illegal dealings with greater caution and fewer partners. But he lived in constant fear of discovery, jumping at every police siren, avoiding cameras, never staying in one place too long. His wealth brought no peace. His sleep was troubled by recurring nightmares, a woman in glasses chasing him through endless library stacks, her hands reaching for him, her voice calling out accusations in English he couldn't escape. In 1992, an elderly man matching Brennan's description was found dead of natural causes in a nursing home in Bordeaux. French police, following up on a decades-old Interpol notice, collected fingerprints and dental records. The investigation took 3 months, but eventually confirmation came. Philippe Mercier had been Victor Brennan. He had lived to be 82, dying peacefully in his sleep, a fate far kinder than the one he'd given Eleanor Hartley. Margaret received the news from a young detective who'd taken up the cold case as a personal project. She was 56 by then, preparing for retirement from teaching. She sat in her living room, the same house she'd grown up in, kept exactly as her mother had left it, and listened to the detective explain that her mother's killer was dead, had been dead for nearly 3 months, before anyone realized who he really was. "I'm sorry we couldn't catch him while he was alive," the detective said. "Sorry there was no trial, no justice in the traditional sense." Margaret looked at the photograph on her mantel, Eleanor and Thomas and baby Margaret, taken in 1936 before the war, before tragedy, when their family was whole and happy. "There was justice," she said quietly. "Not in a courtroom, perhaps, but he spent 40 years running, hiding, afraid. That's a kind of justice, isn't it? A kind of prison." After the detective left, Margaret went to her mother's old desk, the one from their house, not the library. Eleanor had kept a journal, though she'd never written in it consistently. Margaret had read it countless times over the years, searching for some final wisdom, some explanation of why her mother had taken the risks she'd taken. Most entries were mundane, observations about weather, notes about books read, short mentions of Margaret's school achievements. But there was one entry, dated March 15th, 1955, just 8 days before Eleanor's death, that Margaret returned to often. Margaret asked me today why I love working at the library so much. She said it seems tedious sometimes, all the cataloging and record-keeping. I tried to explain that it's not about the records themselves, but what they represent. Every book in our collection is someone's knowledge, someone's truth, someone's story. By protecting those books, organizing them, making them accessible, we're protecting truth itself. In a world that saw so much destruction and lies during the war, that feels important. That feels necessary. I told her that if I died tomorrow, I'd want her to know that I spent my life in service of something meaningful. She laughed and told me I was being dramatic. I hope she's right. I hope I have many more years of tedious cataloging ahead of me. Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face as they had countless times before. Her mother hadn't had many more years. She'd had 8 more days, but she had died exactly as she'd lived, in service of truth, protecting knowledge, refusing to look away from corruption simply because confronting it was dangerous. In the decades since Eleanor's death, Margaret had struggled with anger, with grief, with a sense of injustice that never fully faded. But she had also come to understand something important. Her mother's life wasn't defined by her death. Eleanor Hartley had been more than a victim. She had been a librarian, a scholar, a mother, a friend. She had touched countless lives through her work, had helped thousands of people access the information they needed, had preserved pieces of human knowledge for future generations. The murder was part of her story, but it wasn't the whole story. Margaret made a decision then. She would write it all down. Everything Arthur Groves had told her over the years, everything she'd learned from court records and investigations, everything she remembered of her mother. Not for publication necessarily, but for the record, so that someday, when all the principals were dead and social embarrassment no longer mattered, someone might read it and understand the full truth of what had happened in the Manchester Central Library on March 23, 1955. She began that evening, filling page after page with careful handwriting, reconstructing events from fragments of memory and official reports. It took her 3 years to complete, working in the evenings after her teaching duties were done. The manuscript ran to nearly 400 pages, including copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, photographs, and Arthur Groves' personal notes which he had bequeathed to her in his will. Margaret sealed the manuscript in a file box and donated it to the Manchester Central Library's archives, with instructions that it was not to be opened until 2055, 100 years after her mother's death. By then, everyone involved would be long gone. The truth could be told without causing pain to the innocent or protecting the guilty. The librarian who accepted the donation, a young woman named Sarah Chen, handled the box with appropriate reverence. "Your mother is something of a legend here," Sarah said. "We all know the story, or at least the basic outline. She's an inspiration to everyone who works in this building." Margaret smiled, touched. She would have liked that, being remembered not for how she died, but for why she lived. The hidden truth, what Margaret never learned, what no one learned until long after all the principals were dead, was that Eleanor Hartley had left one final piece of evidence, one last breadcrumb that might have solved the case years earlier if only someone had found it. On the afternoon of March 23rd, after Eleanor had discovered the hidden papers in the mysterious German book, she had done something that proved her librarian's instinct for preserving information. Before examining the book further, before the stranger had appeared and everything had gone wrong, Eleanor had taken 15 minutes to photograph several pages of the book and the hidden documents using the camera in her office. She had been truthful when she'd told her killer that she'd photographed the evidence. What she'd lied about was mailing the photographs to Oxford. Instead, in a moment of paranoid caution that probably saved her daughter's life, Eleanor had hidden the developed photographs in a place only she knew about. The Manchester Central Library had sustained significant damage during the Manchester Blitz of 1940 and 1941. One bomb had partially collapsed the East Wing, destroying thousands of books and damaging the structure. In the years of rebuilding that followed, Eleanor had discovered a space behind a damaged wall panel in the basement archives, a gap between the original Victorian construction and the wartime repairs, perhaps 8 inches wide and 3 feet long. Eleanor had occasionally used this space to hide things she wanted to keep absolutely secure: sensitive personnel records during the war, valuable documents during the rebuilding chaos. She'd never told anyone about it, Not even Henry Ashford. It was her secret, her insurance policy against the disorder that sometimes threatened to overwhelm the library's careful systems. That's where she'd hidden the photographs on March 23rd, probably in the hour before the library closed, before she'd gone back upstairs to continue her work. She'd slipped the envelope of photographs into the hidden space, replaced the loose panel, and presumably intended to retrieve them the next day, when she could plan her next move more carefully. But there had been no next day for Eleanor, and the photographs had remained in their hiding place, undiscovered, as years turned into decades. In 2003, the Manchester Central Library underwent a major renovation. The building was nearly 150 years old, and despite regular maintenance, it needed significant structural work. The basement archives were completely gutted and rebuilt, with modern climate control and storage systems replacing the Victorian-era shelving. A construction worker named Tom Brennan, no relation to Victor, was removing wall panels when he discovered the hidden space. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially deteriorated, was an envelope containing 6 black-and-white photographs and a handwritten note. Tom couldn't read the German text in the photographs, but the note was in English, written in Eleanor Hartley's careful hand. Evidence of smuggling operation. If anything happens to me, please ensure these reach Detective Inspector Arthur Groves, Manchester Police, March 23, 1955, E.H. The construction foreman contacted the library administration, who contacted the police, who eventually connected the photographs to the 48-year-old cold case. The German text was translated, the initials in the transaction records were identified, and several pieces of looted artwork were finally traced to their current locations. By then, most of the people involved were dead. Victor Brennan had been dead for 11 years. Thomas Whitmore had been dead for 35 years. Henry Ashford for 19. Arthur Groves for 38. Eleanor herself for 48. Only Margaret remained, now 67 years old and living in a retirement home after suffering a mild stroke the previous year. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Hendricks brought her the photographs personally, explaining how they'd been found and what they revealed. Margaret held the old pictures with trembling hands, looking at her mother's handwriting, imagining those last desperate hours when Eleanor had hidden this evidence, hoping it would matter. She was so brave, Margaret whispered, even knowing she was in danger. She made sure the truth would survive. The photographs helped us recover 3 paintings and 2 illuminated manuscripts, Hendricks told her. They'd been sold and resold several times over the years, but we traced them back through the transaction records. They've been returned to their rightful owners, or their owners' heirs. Your mother's evidence helped right a wrong, even nearly 50 years later. Margaret smiled through her tears. She would have liked that. Justice delayed isn't justice denied. Not really. Not if it comes eventually. Hendricks hesitated, then said, "There's something else. We've been in contact with French authorities about Victor Brennan's estate. He died with significant assets, money from his years of dealing. Under international law regarding stolen goods and criminal profits, those assets are being seized and distributed to various restitution funds. The French government has agreed that a portion should go to victims' families. You're entitled to compensation, Mrs. Hartley. Quite substantial compensation, actually." Margaret shook her head immediately. "I don't want his money. It's blood money, dirty money. Donate it to something worthwhile. The library, perhaps. A fund to help train librarians, or to preserve rare books, or to educate people about protecting cultural heritage." She looked down at the photographs again. "My mother didn't do this for money. She did it because it was right. Honor that, not the fact that she was murdered." In 2004, the Eleanor Hartley Foundation was established with funds from Victor Brennan's seized assets. Poetic justice of a kind. The foundation provides grants to libraries throughout the UK, supporting preservation efforts, training programs, and security systems to protect rare collections. It also funds annual scholarships for library science students, particularly those interested in archival work and cultural heritage protection. The Manchester Central Library dedicated a permanent exhibit to Eleanor's life and work, including the photographs she'd hidden, the brass owl bookend that had struck her killer, and selections from the manuscript Margaret had written. The exhibit doesn't shy away from the violence of Eleanor's death, but it frames it as part of a larger story about courage, integrity, and the importance of protecting truth. Thousands of people visit the exhibit each year. School groups learn about the importance of libraries in preserving cultural heritage. University students study the smuggling case as an example of how World War II's disruptions created opportunities for black market exploitation. And ordinary library patrons pause to read about a woman who died doing her job, protecting the institution she loved. Margaret Hartley died peacefully in 2006, at age 70. She was buried beside her mother and father in Southern Cemetery, Manchester. Her obituary in the Manchester Guardian described her as a dedicated educator and the daughter of murdered librarian Eleanor Hartley, whose courage in exposing a smuggling ring cost her her life in 1955. At Margaret's funeral, the current head librarian of the Manchester Central Library gave a eulogy that concluded, "Margaret spent her entire life honoring her mother's memory, not through bitterness or revenge, but through service. She taught thousands of children, established scholarships, and ultimately ensured that Eleanor Hartley's story would be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of ordinary people to stand up for what's right. In that, she was her mother's daughter in every sense." Epilogue. The sealed manuscript Margaret had deposited in the archives was opened in 2055, as per her instructions, on the 100th anniversary of Eleanor's death. By then, the world had changed in ways Eleanor could never have imagined. Libraries were digital as well as physical. Books existed as electronic files as often as bound volumes. Information was accessible instantly from anywhere in the world. But the fundamental truth Eleanor had devoted her life to remained unchanged. Knowledge matters, truth matters, and protecting both requires courage and integrity. Her story, when finally published in full, resonated with a new generation facing its own battles against misinformation, cultural theft, and the erosion of public institutions. The Manchester Central Library still stands, still serves its community, still protects and preserves knowledge. In the third-floor rare books collection, researchers still examine centuries-old manuscripts, still trace the provenance of historical documents, still work to understand the past. And sometimes, in the quiet hours when the building is nearly empty and the street noise fades to a distant murmur, staff members swear they can feel a presence on the third floor, not threatening or frightening, but watchful, protective, a presence that seems to move between the stacks, checking that books are properly shelved, that records are accurately maintained, that the institution's integrity remains intact. They call it Eleanor's ghost, though no one really believes in such things. But they respect it nonetheless, this sense of continuity with the past, this reminder that the work they do matters because someone once thought it was worth dying for. On March 23rd each year, the library holds a brief ceremony in Eleanor's honor. Staff members gather in the reading room, read her name aloud, and observe a moment of silence. Then they return to their work, cataloging, shelving, helping patrons, preserving knowledge, continuing the mission Eleanor Hartley gave her life to protect. The books remain, organized and accessible. The truth endures, protected by those who come after. And Eleanor Hartley's name lives on, not as a victim, but as a guardian. A librarian who stood against corruption and paid the ultimate price. A woman who fought for truth when it would have been easier to look away. A mother who left her daughter the most valuable inheritance possible. An example of courage and integrity that transcended death itself. In the end, that's the story hidden in the books, written in sacrifice, preserved in memory. The story of Eleanor Hartley, who died protecting knowledge, and in doing so, became immortal.